Entrepreneurship is one of the key drivers of economic growth, which, some studies suggest that it could explain 1/3 to 1/2 of the differences in economic growths between states or between countries.
Thank you for joining us for a new edition of the Perfectus podcast. My name is Gonzalo Schwarz. I'm the founder and CEO of the Archbridge Institute, the home of Perfectus magazine. This podcast is part of our short series of conversations on the economics of human flourishing, which we define as the study of how markets, people, organizations, and institutions support the economic foundations of social mobility and human flourishing. And for this episode, I'm delighted to have three great guests to discuss entrepreneurship and business dynamism in the context of the economics of human flourishing and social mobility. And so first we have Justin Callais, who's our research fellow with the Archbridge Institute and an assistant professor of economics at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Second, we have Ufuk Akcigit, who's the Arnold C. Harberger Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago and one of the world's leading experts on business dynamism with a wide variety, of academic papers written on the subject. And more recently, Ufuk also partnered with Intuit QuickBooks to develop a small business index, which we'll link later as part of this conversation. And last but not least, we have Noah Trudeau, who's an assistant professor of data analytics in the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University and a fellow with the Archbridge Institute as well. And he's the co-author, along with Dr. Ed Timmons, of our Institute's State Occupational Licensing Index that ranks all 50 states on how many barriers to entry and licenses there are across the country. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We'll go through just a couple of questions for each to sort of discuss how each of the areas that were related to entrepreneurship and dynamism relate to mobility, and just more broadly about what's the state of each of these areas independently. So in your case, Justin, you're the lead author of our Social Mobility in the 50 States report, which we released at ranking all of the 50 states across various categories and indicators that we're sort of positioning as the barriers or potential indicators of social mobility. And one of the bigger categories, the big category that we have, is a focus on entrepreneurship and growth. I was wondering if you can explain how entrepreneurship and growth relate to social mobility, and what are the subcategories and indicators, some of them, a few examples of what do we use in this part of the index.
Yeah, definitely. To kind of motivate this section, it really came about as thinking about the different types of barriers that exist for people to achieve whatever, their dream is, or whatever a full realization of self is. So to kind of take a little bit of a step back, you want to think about both the artificial barriers and natural barriers that exist in someone achieving mobility. Artificial barriers are usually imposed by some external authority and is going to affect a group or a specific group of people, right? That might be statewide, that might be in specific industries, that might be certain parts of a state, right? Kind of depends on what the policy is. While natural ones, occur more naturally with and typically exist at more the individual or family level. Obviously, those barriers can overlap or influence one another, but it's important to consider both. And that's kind of where the foundation of thinking about what should go into this pillar of social mobility comes into play. And when you think about entrepreneurship and economic growth, you tend to think a lot more on the artificial side, right? There's obviously ones that we'll talk about throughout the rest of this conversation on, such as licensing, regulation, taxes. Of course, you can think about different natural barriers that might exist for someone to, achieve, become an entrepreneur or achieve, high growth status in an area. That could be equally or just as important. And those could be things like, how involved are parents in the child's life. You kind of see some studies that suggest that parental engagement can have positive impacts on kids, not just while they're children, but in their later lives. And that could easily show itself in entrepreneurship. And to kind of think back of this, entrepreneurship, is largely a local phenomenon. While there's obviously trends in entrepreneurship in the U.S. that Ufuk is a much better expert than me on, and I'm sure we'll touch on later, there are going to be differences between states. So if you think about one of the measures of entrepreneurship that we consider here is business dynamism, which are used from the economic innovation group. And even there, you could see, you see the trends over time that suggest that business dynamism in the U.S. is declining, but that it's, a lot of it is a local phenomenon. If you look at things like, there's the startup rates, like how your firm, or how quickly firms are starting up in an area, it can range from less than 5% in places like West Virginia to close to 12% in Utah. Or growth in firms can range from negative like 3 or 4% in Hawaii to almost 6% in Utah. The amount of inventors that occur in it, or the amount of inventors that there are per capita in the state is like 2 per 1,000 in Massachusetts, which is while it's less than 0, so much lower in places like Mississippi, Louisiana, and West Virginia. And similarly, when you think of migration rates, well, can range from 3% in Idaho to negative 1% in places like New York, California, and unfortunately my home state of Louisiana. So when we think about what should go here, it's kind of making the seemingly obvious point that one of the many ways in which someone can achieve mobility is through some sort of job and career. So crucial to that is the goal of entrepreneurship. In part because entrepreneurship can have, if someone goes into entrepreneurship and they do it for an opportunity, they see it as their way of basically achieving the best life that they want to live. But also entrepreneurs on its own do not just benefit the owner of the firm. Successful entrepreneurs who are productive can bring about new products and services to markets, which can make consumers better off by offering either cheaper products or higher quality. Entrepreneurs also can provide better employment opportunities, evidenced by the fact that employees agreed to take those jobs in the first place, suggesting that they're better off than they were in whatever position they were in before. And, just kind of from a basic point, entrepreneurship is one of the key drivers of economic growth, which, some studies suggest that it could explain 1/3 to 1/2 of the differences in economic growths between states or between countries. So when we came down to actually measuring this, we looked at within the entrepreneurship and economic growth pillar, we thought about 3 major categories, which was regulation. So there's going to be occupational licensing, something that Noah and Ed Timmons do really well in their occupational licensing report that I'm sure he'll touch on later. State level regulation strategies. So what is the sort of barriers that states put on themselves in terms of regulatory barriers, as well as things like land use regulation, right? If you think of someone who has any sort of is trying to live somewhere, well, how freely can you use the land in the area, right? And is going to have the ability to build more houses, have cheaper access to housing affordability. And since housing is one of the major budget items that someone has in a family unit, well, land use regulations can play a large part in that. We also considered taxes, different sorts of taxes from the tax foundation. So we look at corporate taxes, individual income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes. And finally, and perhaps, at least in terms of this conversation, perhaps most importantly, is the idea of business dynamism, right? And I've touched on that a little bit, but it's the idea as to how dynamic of the area that you have that kind of breeds entrepreneurship, right? And you kind of see this sort of spillover effects of entrepreneurship influencing other factors. So you want to kind of consider the sort of full dynamic situation of the state. And the Economic Innovation Group, like I mentioned, looks at core startup rates. What's the share of workers that work at firms less than 5 years old, meaning that it's a place where, there's younger firms that can compete for potential new employees, can bring people in from outside the state or within the state. Just the growth in total firms, right? So if you have negative growth, that means more businesses are closing than are opening. Patents or inventions, housing permits, reallocation rates, labor force participation rates, migration rates, all these things that kind of paint a broader picture about the dynamic environment in the state. We want to consider all these factors. So those are kind of the main points, I guess, and kind of the background information as to where we came when it comes to this project.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Justin. And thank you for closing on that topic of business dynamism, because then we can smoothly transition to Ufuk and asking you, Ufuk, if you can please explain what's the current state of business dynamism, to step back and be a little bit more macro about the bigger trends. What are the trends of business dynamism in the United States? If you see any issues, short-term, long-term, if you can sort of delve a little bit into that.
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gonzalo. First of all, I think the big question we should ask ourselves is that why do we care about dynamism? We care about dynamism because we know that Schumpeterian forces, where the more creative entrepreneurs, the more creative firms are expanding at the expense of unproductive firms, is important and essential for any economy. And U.S. has been extremely successful in keeping its economy dynamic, in the sense that new entrepreneurs coming into the economy and replacing the unproductive ones, generating turnover, that's been really the signature of the U.S. economy compared to, for instance, European economy. When you look at the entry rate in Germany compared to the U.S., it's less than half. And so that's a significant difference. And pumping fresh blood into the economy is essential. But business dynamism is not about entry only. It's also about competition among incumbents. Sometimes, new technologies can be introduced by incumbents too. But in that case, incumbents should be growing at the expense of unproductive incumbents. So creative incumbents should be growing at the expense of unproductive incumbents. And that's why, when we talk about business dynamism, entry rate is one important indicator, but another one is the job reallocation rate among incumbents is another important indicator. So now let's look at the data and ask ourselves, how do these indicators look like in the long run in the US? Since 1980, the entry rate in the US has been on a declining trend. So, the entry rate used to be about 14% in 1980. Now it's down to close to 7%. So there has been a significant decline in the entry rate. And when we look at the job reallocation rate, again, job reallocation rate has been also steadily declining since 1980, which shows that, and then, with Sina Ateş from Federal Reserve Board, we looked at various indicators, not only these two, but 10 different indicators to understand how business dynamism is shaping up in the US. And in all these different indicators, we've seen that in the long run, business dynamism has been on the decline trend. So that's, an important observation, but that's a long run trend. And then what happened in the shorter run, in closer times? Indeed, we experienced a macro shock by COVID, and COVID really hit the economy, global economy, in many different ways. And post-COVID, not only we experienced the supply chain disruptions, but also a very severe inflation problem. And to combat inflation, of course, the central banks, including the Federal Reserve, of course, start to raise the policy rates. And, post-pandemic, the inflation rate has been almost 40-year high, and the interest rate has been close to 20-year high. And, of course, these type of macro conditions are not necessarily helping business dynamism, especially for smaller entities, for smaller enterprises. But do we have enough discussion of this? I have some doubts about that, because, typically the discussion has been that, since the monetary policy tightening, surprisingly, the labor market has been tight. And that's why, and also, there have been also some quotes on the number of new business registries, jumping from 3.5 million to 5 million annually. And thinking that, well, this is not bad for small businesses, especially. Maybe it's even good news for small businesses. But I think this is exactly where we have to be really, really careful. First, what does economic theory tell us? If you don't have internal resources, internal capital, you're not going to have easy time. So that should be our prior to begin with. Then what are we missing in the data? And I think in the data, what we're missing is that when we are looking at the business registry numbers, we are not really looking at the employment numbers. So normally a successful business would be growing, as we discussed also in the beginning. Justin also made a very nice introduction in the beginning. When we want to talk about dynamism, we talk about entrepreneurs starting new business and expanding their business, hiring more people, creating more jobs. And that way they are starting to capture bigger and bigger market share. And that's exactly the statistics that we need to look at. Unfortunately, when we look at the heterogeneity across the firm size distribution, as also Justin mentioned, these business dynamism indicators are very, very heterogeneous. When we look at small businesses versus large businesses, post-COVID, there has been a very significant shift from small businesses towards large businesses in terms of economic activity. Even though the overall labor numbers, employment numbers have been relatively stable, in terms of the composition, there has been a significant shift from small business to large businesses. And where do we see this? Of course, for this, we need to be a bit creative. And of course, recent advancements in technology and data opportunities are opening up new avenues for us. And here, you also mentioned, Gonzalo, we partnered with Intuit QuickBooks then by utilizing their Intuit QuickBooks Online customer database, we are able to predict what's happening to the small businesses in the US economy through some benchmarking exercise. I'll save the technical details now. Through that study, we observed that small business activities has been declining as the theory would predict. Moreover, what does the theory says? Well, the theory again says that when the financial conditions are getting tighter, typically the riskiest group would suffer most. And again, the riskiest group is the small businesses. When we look at their savings, when we look at the savings of small businesses, the savings start to come down, especially once the disaster loans stopped after COVID. Moreover, we also see more and more that small businesses are relying on their credit cards to finance their business. Indeed, the credit card usage increased by about 20% relative to the pre-pandemic period. And as we all know, credit cards are a very expensive way of financing someone's business. It's not the case that they use their credit card more often and then they pay back the balance at the end. In that case, we shouldn't be that worried. No, they are also carrying more balance from month to month, which means that they are really feeling the heat of high interest rates in current environment. So that's why I think, the main takeaway here is that in the longer perspective, the business dynamism indicator are coming down, and the literature has produced a lot of studies on this. Very, very creative papers have shown in many different ways that business dynamism in general was coming down over the past several decades. But more recently, post-COVID, small businesses especially have been affected quite significantly. And I think, currently we are discussing a lot about industrial policy. And, while we are at it, I think it is important also to discuss how we can make the small and young businesses again thrive and generate dynamism and creative destruction.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ufuk. And that's also, thank you very much for creating a great bridge to go into Noah's the next question I have for Noah, because as you're studying occupational licensing in the United States, a lot of the small businesses, a lot of people who operate small businesses maybe are at that level where a license is crucial for them to start as a business, start something that can hopefully maybe then grow and provide more employment for others. So I was wondering if you can explain what's the current state of occupational licensing in the United States? What have been those changes? It seems like at the same time that I think business dynamism hasn't been in decline, licensing requirements have been going up. So if you can, maybe what's the historical trend on that? And what are the differences that you identify in the report that you've done for Archbridge in terms of barriers to entry and licenses, that you make that distinction in?
Yeah, absolutely.
please.
So occupational licensing is, in terms of the breadth of history, is a relatively new phenomenon. This idea that we have to have a government approval to work in an industry or to work in a specific occupation. So right around the turn of the 20th century, somewhere around 1920s, 1930s, we see about 1 in 20 occupations has to have a license for you to be able to perform that job. So we see it a lot in doctors. Milton Friedman wrote one of the early licensing papers in the 1900s on licensing dentists as opposed to licensing doctors, mentioning that dentists wanted to have the same level of prestige as your normal physician, so they were pushing for government licensure. And today, in the roughly 100 years later, we're seeing about 1 in 5 occupations, more than 20% require an occupational license. So we're talking about millions of Americans. And one thing that is often overlooked with occupational licensing is there's a lack of a standard across the U.S. So occupational licensing is mostly done at the state level. There are some local level occupational licenses that are determined by your city, your county, your municipality, depending on which state you live in. And there are some federal licenses that are just blanket across the entire U.S. But by far the large majority is state level regulation, and there is no standard as to how states identify occupational licenses, who they apply to between states. So our index, our state occupational licensing index, which we're looking at the 2024 edition coming out very soon, looks at 2 different measures of occupational licensing and the potential effects of it, or the breadth of it. So occupational licensing, because it is not standardized at any level, we look at occupation titles. So what we might think of colloquially is someone who works as a plumber, an electrician, a nurse practitioner, a barber, a hairstylist, a cosmetologist. You name what the job title is, and we have attempted to gather as many of these occupational titles as possible. And then we look at two different measures, what we call barriers and what we call licenses. Licenses are very easy to understand. A license exists if a state has a named license for that occupational title. So something like that would be lawyer. Every state has a state bar association that licenses lawyers. So every state, you have to get your license to practice as a lawyer. Every state has a state bar. That state gets a license for lawyer. That state additionally is what we call a barrier for lawyer, meaning that you have to have some sort of license to practice that occupation. Where the barrier measure gets interesting is because states have different rules on the scope of occupational licenses, it could be that you need an occupational license not for your job title, but perhaps some of the things you are doing at your job require a license. So an example of this is in Alabama, we have, so I recently went for a massage. We have a license for massage therapists. So on the wall in my massage therapist's office has his little massage therapist licensed by the state of Alabama Board of Massage Therapists. Well, we're getting talking. He was a college football player, and we're having a discussion. I've been running recently. I said, my left leg is really bothering me. And he says, yeah, I noticed that while we were doing massage. I cannot give you specific advice on how to fix that as a professional. He said, but I was an athlete. He said, just us talking as friends, I would say that you are probably babying your left leg. But if I were to try to give you that information professionally, I would need to have a personal trainer license, because he cannot give me professional advice on how to change my running style. Although similar industry, he has expertise on muscle, skeletal, all of that. He cannot tell me he cannot tell me that I may be babying my leg one way or another while running. So in that case, my massage therapist, he has a license for massage therapist, he has a license for personal training, or he has a license for massage therapist and physical therapy, which is not the same thing. And he is working on his personal trainer license to where he can professionally say that maybe you're babying your leg, or maybe you're doing this, or maybe you should try changing this in your everyday workouts to prevent this from happening again. So in some states, they may not have a personal trainer license. Maybe that falls under physical therapy, or some states may not have trying to think of ones that are more common. Some states tend to break up licenses into multiple subspecialties. So where some states just have an electrician license, some states have master, journeyman, and apprentice electricians. So we see a unique way of labeling these things. Or in some states, sometimes you just need a much more complex license to perform a job. So in my home state of Alabama, where I live currently, you cannot be an acupuncturist. You cannot practice acupuncture without being a licensed physician. It is considered something that only a doctor can practice. You have to have a DO, an MD, a PhD, or some other type of doctorate, and get your physician's license based on that. So some states, though, have a practitioner of Oriental medicine, or a acupuncturist, or East Asian medicine license, something that would allow someone to practice acupuncture. So what we see in the U.S. is this complex interaction, what any individual job is, and we're trying to encapsulate that with our barriers aspect of this license. So what we end up ultimately with is an idea of how many direct licenses each state has kind of on their books, how many state boards they have, or at least how many individual licenses they're offering of the occupations we're able to track. And then we also have an idea of how many occupation titles each of those all of those licenses as a whole bar. So the barriers give us an idea of how hard it is to get into a regulated occupation. Well, this licenses idea gives an idea of regulation on a whole, or bureaucracy as a whole.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Noah. That is definitely a worrying trend if those changes have gone from 1 in 20 to 1 in 4 occupations. Some of them might be obviously justified, or might be some reason obviously that it's there, but a lot of it from, I think, the work that you've done, or even Maurice Kleiner, Minnesota, I think he is at right now, have shown that some of them are sort of, we could live without that number of how many licenses there is, and that is sort of slowing down. In another study that your colleague Ed Timmons did as well, and how that relates to lower levels of mobility, of social mobility, and higher levels of inequality as well. And building on that, I want to go back to you, Ufuk, before going to Justin for another question on our index. But I'm wondering if you can also discuss, and you did it a little bit obviously there in your first answer, on how business dynamism relates to social mobility, because I share with you that we don't speak a lot about all the issues that are related to mobility, but one of them, issues around business dynamism and how it has declined. But I think one of the main reasons why we should is the relationship that it might have with mobility. A lot of the discussions on social mobility or reducing inequality come down to either how we can tweak the welfare system, how can we reduce maybe inequality by taxes or transfer, which, not to go into that sort of rabbit hole, that's a whole different conversation maybe around inequality and the figures there. But just more broadly, I think we've been discussing that the main way we can climb the income ladder is if we just reduce inequality or have more transfers, and not what is, I think, the main source of income for most Americans, which is a job. And it is through that creative destruction, through creation of businesses, creation of jobs, small, big, medium. But at the end of the day, that's, I think, should be the focus of that. So I was wondering if you can discuss that through your work, and what have you found or think about as business dynamism relates to social mobility.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, social mobility and business dynamism are quite interrelated issues. Again, going back to the basic, Schumpeterian idea of creative destruction, the idea there is independent of someone's background. As long as somebody has a creative idea, better than the incumbents, they can exercise their ideas and flourish. And again, the US economy has also provided innovative solutions for such entrepreneurs who might be suffering from, for instance, upfront capital initially. And the venture capital business evolved around those creative entrepreneurs. And the US economy has been leading the world in terms of finding creative solutions to somehow nurture young entrepreneurs who have good ideas to exercise. And that way, even if somebody is born to maybe to a disadvantaged background, or have an unusual background, independent of someone's background, as long as we allow good ideas to rise in the society, then social mobility will follow. Because somebody who is born to a poor family, as long as they are smart and have good ideas, they can rise up. That's definitely related to the entry dynamics, and the fact that we are observing a declining entry is concerning in terms of what this will imply for social mobility. We did some also study on this a while ago with Philippe Augion and Richard Plumdell and David Hemmons, trying to study the social mobility aspects of innovation. And innovation does contribute to social mobility in any region in the US, unless incumbents are spending heavily on lobbying activities. So I think, when we think about social mobility, creative destruction is extremely important, and we need to make sure that anybody, whoever has a good idea can exercise his idea. In another study that we did, and this time we looked at the Danish economy, for instance, we observed that to become an entrepreneur, for instance, education is the most important ingredient, especially having a technical training. But if somebody doesn't have access to high quality education, then there's no way, they can nurture and train their talent and become an entrepreneur, become an inventor, for instance. So as a result, when we look at work through the lens of the Danish study that we conducted, having equal access to education is an important policy to support creative destruction and to support social mobility through entrepreneurship and innovation. And another important finding of the study was that R&D subsidies or subsidies to businesses will be ineffective unless they are complemented with some structural reforms on education policies. So unless we combine industrial policies with high quality education, those policy interventions won't be effective, because without having good players in your team, you cannot win the championship. So everything starts from the talent pool, and the top priority has to be first strengthening the talent pool. And of course, there has been a lot of studies also showing that, for instance, early childhood interventions are also very important to educate the kids and giving them a brighter future. And we also show in our studies that it's not only about also early childhood, which is extremely important, but also providing all the way to the technical training to talented people is also very important to foster innovation and entrepreneurship. So that's why I think when it comes to the social mobility aspect, we need to think about the education, the training that we are offering to individuals in the society, especially giving equal opportunity in terms of access to education, will make the U.S. economy and the U.S. firms utilize the talent pool better.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's a great discussion on that. Justin, to go back to you, based on what we discussed and based on some of the results that you've seen in the index that we did on social mobility, what was more surprising, just specifically relating to business dynamism and growth and entrepreneurship across the 50 states?
Yeah, so one thing I'll mention, I guess not necessarily surprising, but just I think it's probably an important thing to mention, is that it's not like a red-blue thing, right? It's not like Republican states do really well in entrepreneurship and economic growth and blue states don't, right? Or vice versa. It's really mixed, right? So you see some of the higher score states in this area could be, are often, some red, some blue, some kind of purple in the middle. So you see like Wyoming and South Dakota and Utah ranked towards the top. We also see states like Nevada, Colorado, which would not really, fit the sort of popular discourse on the topic. Similarly, you'll see, red and blue states at the bottom. So like Arkansas scores last on our index in terms of entrepreneurship and economic growth, as well as West Virginia and Mississippi. But you also see places like Massachusetts and New Jersey and Rhode Island and New York very low too. So it's not, this isn't just capturing some sort of like Republican Democrat dynamic, which I think is important to note at least. When it comes to surprising outcomes, I think the one that at least people, if they looked at it, would be perhaps the most surprised about, and hopefully I'll try to convince you as to maybe why you shouldn't be so surprised, is that Texas scores right around the middle. So they score, I think, 20th or 19th on entrepreneurship and economic growth, in part because they do really well on certain measures, but they do really poorly on others. So going back to those three pillars of regulation, taxes, and business dynamism, Texas scores 5th in business dynamism. As you'd expect, right? A lot of firms moving there. It's an entrepreneurial environment for the most part. You see a huge migration towards there. But where they seem to struggle is something that when Noah was talking earlier about occupational licensing, is that Texas has some of the strictest occupational licensing laws in the country. Similarly, they also have some of the strictest state-level regulation burdens that they place on themselves. They rank, I believe, 44th or 45th in the country on regulatory environment, suggesting that there's certainly room for improvement there. That it's not, things are not just perfect and there's no changes need to be made. Obviously, I think most people could think of changes that could go on there. Similarly, you think of Texas as, low income tax state, so taxes are pretty good. Well, that's in part true, but it's also not painting the whole story. So in taxes, they rank right in the middle, 24th in the entire country. And that's in part because while their individual income tax rates are some of the lowest in the country, they score really poorly on property taxes, and they score really poorly on corporate taxes. The reason that they score poorly on corporate taxes is they do something a little bit different than what a lot of other places do. is that they don't have, a set kind of corporate tax, but they have a gross receipts tax, which is a quasi proxy for corporate taxes. So they're really, they're doing a lot of things that are burdensome for entrepreneurship and economic growth in that end. So that was kind of the one that stood out the most. I'll say the states that score the best would be Wyoming, Delaware, South Dakota, Utah, Florida. And again, at the bottom is New York, Rhode Island, West Virginia, Hawaii, New Jersey, Arkansas. And, so states kind of range all over, kind of depending on whatever you're looking at here, which I think is at least an interesting aspect to point out. So, but really, there wasn't too many surprises there, other than the fact that Texas score is quite low, and hopefully in the discussion it added a little nuance as to why that would be the case.
Thank you, Justin. That's sort of building into my last question that I wanted also to follow up, because it seems like some of those areas are the ones that sort of states should be focusing on reforming. So I wanted to just close with Noah, and maybe Ufuk at the end too, on what are some policies, in your case, Noah, that people are taking measures or proposals at the policy level that are being discussed or were reformed recently in terms of number of licensing in different states. And then I'll just go with Ufuk as well. Like, what do you think are some policies or measures that we can do to improve business dynamism? Let's start with you, Noah, in terms of the licensing.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of licensing, there's definite good news. Yes, we are seeing growth in licensing, and we are seeing occasionally we see a little bit of decline. And one of the measures that we see that helps with decline, or at least helps with constant observation of the true burden that licensing can cause, is we see a lot of states are opting to adopt what we call sunset laws. So they create a sunset committee, and that committee's job is to audit the occupational licenses that are active in each state, and every so many years each occupational license comes up for what they call sunset. And if the committee cannot find justification for that license to continue to exist, then the state will sunset that license, and that license will go away. And we see these sunset committees do actually choose to sunset some occupational licenses. So recently, I believe West Virginia sunset their hearing aid fitter license. Some other states have sunset similar licenses in that instance. We also see states adopting what we call universal licensing recognition. So I mentioned one of the issues that we have is that there's no standard for what an occupation is. Like, we all have an idea of what a plumber or an electrician or a massage therapist is, but there is no standard definition across all 50 states. One thing that is helping with that is states are choosing to adopt universal licensing recognition. So if you have a license in another state, that state will let you, essentially by reciprocity, they will recognize your license if you choose to move there. So some states that adopted this last year were Ohio and Virginia, and I believe some states have this up on their discussion for their legislatures this year. Virginia adopted it last year, specifically their governor citing that they wanted to attract more people to move to Virginia. They were seeing more people moving out. They were seeing declining population for the first time in years, decades even. And so the governor of Virginia really pushed for this universal licensing adoption. One issue we see with it, though, is some states like to qualify it to what they call similarly significant barriers. So it's similar education, similar apprenticeship requirements, and some states have a residency requirement. So some states require you actually live in that state before they'll recognize your license and let you have one for their state as well. So one thing you can expect to see in the 2024 edition of our State Occupational Licensing Index is that we have actually quantified whether or not states have adopted licensing recognition, whether or not they have done so with these kind of stipulations. And we've actually managed to kind of give them like a gold, silver, or bronze medal based on this. So if they've adopted universal licensing recognition without any qualifications, then any stipulations, we give them what we would consider being gold star. If they've adopted either a residency or a similarly significant license requirement, we give them a silver. If they have adopted universal license recognition with both of those stipulations, we give them what we consider to be like a bronze star. So it's better than not having it, but when you start to put enough restrictions on it, it starts to become less and less effective. And my colleagues at the NE Regulatory Research Center at Simmons, who is one of the authors on this index, has worked with some of his colleagues as well, and has found that this universal licensing recognition is really important, and it can really improve mobility, both economic and physical mobility for a bunch of individuals. Because being able to take your license with you allows so much more physical mobility. So if you had to move to a different state, but you didn't know if you could continue doing the job that you are a professional at, having that universal licensing recognition makes it a lot more.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Noah. That's great. And Ufuk, let's close with you. What are your recommendations or suggestions on how we can boost dynamism?
Absolutely. So, of course, this is a very, very deep topic and it opens the Pandora box. But I think, just one major point that I would like to make is that, we are in a period where we are discussing industrial policy very widely. And of course, these are big investments, big technological advancements that the governments are planning. But we should always keep in mind that, these business dynamism indicators start to come down beginning from early 80s. And what happened in the early 80s? Again, there was a very significant boost in terms of the industrial policy. And when we look at, for instance, when we look at the microdata, when the government offers R&D tax credit, it's typically the large firms that are utilizing it for various reasons. Of course, one can come up with a long list, but one important aspect is that, of course, large firms have also professionals and lawyers to just utilize these type of potential benefits, whereas smaller entities are having much more difficulty in accessing these type of support programs. And that's why when we look at the across the firm size distribution, it's typically the large firms that are utilizing these type of government supports, which means that, of course, the purpose can be, still the governments might be willing to support the economy, maybe the larger firms due to various other reasons. But we should never forget that, small businesses are not able to utilize these type of programs. And in the current economy, the way the macro conditions are evolving, small businesses and smaller firms are suffering from the ongoing environment. So that's why I think in our ongoing industrial policy debates, we should not forget the smaller firms. Interventions are having a disproportionate impact across the firm size distribution. And for dynamism, we need participation from a smaller part of the firm size distribution, so that because tomorrow's superstars are today's small firms, right? They are just like the children in the family. They are the family's future, but at the same time, they are very fragile in the beginning. And that's why I think industrial policy has to take that into account. So thanks for having me today.
Yeah, that's a great way to close the conversation. I just wanted to thank everyone for Justin, Noah, Ufuk for your great insights. We're going to have a lot of other resources and things that we've discussed here as links for today's conversation. But I just wanted to take the time again to thank you. And I hope that a lot of people internalize a lot of the things that we discussed now to craft better policies that would help entrepreneurship, dynamism, and ultimately more social mobility. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Perfectus podcast. It's been a pleasure to dive into the fascinating world of the economics of human flourishing with our esteemed guests. As we continue this series, we look forward to exploring more about how markets and institutions not only support, but also enhance our social mobility and overall well-being. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform so you don't miss an episode. And for more insights, be sure to visit us at the Archbridge Institute and check out Perfectus magazine. We're excited to bring you more conversations that bridge the gap between economics and the pursuit of human flourishing. Thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.